8:30. Britain's biggest bank is getting rid of 1 in 6 of its staff. That's what we've been told from HSBC this morning. 8,000 jobs to go in the UK and a further 12,000 in the rest of the world. It's part of a complete overhaul of the bank, which could mean that it ends up not being British at all. Kamal Ahmed is our business editor, and he's here in the studio now. Good morning to you, Kamal.
Good morning.
Let's start with these job losses. I mean, we're talking about a huge number, which presumably means that as a result you end up with a very changed UK bank.
You end up with a smaller bank. I think the big message from this really major announcement from HSBC this morning is that global banking has changed, and particularly making money since the financial crisis in developed economies out of banking is very much harder than it was. So pre the financial crisis, you would expand all over the world as aggressively as possible. That has changed. New regulations, new capital requirements, billions of pounds of fines being faced by all the global banks have meant they've had to really look at their structures and start thinking, where do we really focus? And HSBC, the clue is in the title, the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank is what HSBC stands for. Banking Corporation is what HSBC stands for, has decided on what Stuart Gulliver, the chief executive, calls the Asian pivot. It wants to put money in China, and it wants to reduce what it calls its footprint in developed economies. Now, for Britain, I think that's both in its retail and investment banking. Not a radical change for customers. Some branches may close, but it'll still be a significant, big bank in the UK.
Does that mean, because it's been very critical of not least the levy on banks in the UK and the fact that it would suggest it's disproportionately hit. Do we see a situation where as it's ring-fencing its UK bank, it could perhaps be selling it off? It could be reverting to the Midland Bank, which is, of course, largely what it was.
That was the bank it bought in the UK. I think what will happen, this is a sort of sequenced process. So it is reviewing its domicile, where it's headquartered. If it decides that actually its London headquarters, which is where it is at the moment, it would be better served moving lock, stock and barrel to Hong Kong, then, exactly as you say, the issue will be its operations in Britain. Will it want to keep that bank? Because there's the bank levy, the tax that is peculiar to the UK and disproportionately hits HSBC. And also there's this regulation, also peculiar to the UK, the ring fencing, which means the cost of doing business here for banks like HSBC is higher than elsewhere. They've said this review will be completed by 2015. It will also, of course, focus on Britain's relationship with the European Union. That won't be a settled matter by the end of 2015. And speaking to senior HSBC executives, as I have been, they don't believe that Britain will, or the risk is very high of Britain leaving the EU. They think the polling information that we have suggests that the public are relatively sympathetic to staying within the EU. I think the big issue is around this tax, £700 million of cost for HSBC every year. But let's not forget, Hong Kong comes under the People's Republic of China. There is political risk from going into Hong Kong, as any business will face. And so I think it'll be a balance of those two issues.
OK, but there is clearly a bit of a game going on here, messages being sent, which do we presumably know are being received in Downing Street?
Very much so. So tomorrow evening, George Osborne, the Chancellor, makes the Mansion House speech, which is his big speech about financial matters in the UK, the city. What messages will he send about whether he wants big global banks to stay in Britain? Of course, July the 8th is the budget. What message will he send about the banking levy? The banking levy has been increased ever since it was introduced by the coalition government by a significant amount. Will he do that again on July the 8th? Or will he send a little message to banks like HSBC saying, I'm just taking my foot off the accelerator on tax. That might make it easier for you to decide to stay here. Mr. Osborne, as has Sajid Javid, the business secretary, made it very clear they would like HSBC to stay in London.
Come on, Ahmed, thank you very much. Well, listening to that also is Mark Taylor, who's Professor of Finance and Dean at Warwick Business School. He has in the past also worked at the Bank of England, the IMF and the big investment fund BlackRock. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
Is it time for the government to take the pressure off banks? Has the likes of HSBC been treated unfairly?
Well, HSBC is particularly treated unfairly, of course, as Kamal Ahmed was saying, with something like 80% of its profits coming from Asia, only 3% from Europe, only 6% of its pre-tax profits from the UK, and yet it is the biggest contributor to the bank levy, contributing nearly a third of the total or so. So yes, it is a bit strange that UK banks are levied on the size of their balance sheet worldwide, whereas overseas banks here are just the levies only on their UK operations. So it does significantly hit disproportionately and unfairly HSBC, and that's something they will take into account in deciding on their location, as Kamal Ahmed was saying. I think the issue that the government needs to think about is, yes, the financial sector got us into trouble, the banks got us into trouble over the past few years, but it's really a matter of reforming the culture rather than to carry on punishing them. And a 0.21% levy may not sound a lot, but when interest rates are around 0.5%, or its base rate around 0.5%, that can be a significant tax. It adds to something like 6% of HSBC's pre-tax profits. So in the forthcoming Mansion House speech, clearly the Chancellor is not going to completely backtrack on the bank levy. It's actually in the Tory manifesto, but there may be an announcement of a review, having a look at the way the levy is charged.
But there have been so many scandals involving the banks, so many years after they got into trouble, that surely politically it would be very difficult and perhaps wrong to change things.
Well, it will be politically difficult. It's a very populist tax. No one really complains when you put a tax on bankers. But on the other hand, if you have a troublesome teenager, you don't carry on punishing them. You try and educate, train, and reform them, and to some extent love them. And I think the banks need a little bit of loving, even though there have been an unruly teenager over the last few years.
As far as HSBC is concerned, it's raising this threat. Look, clues in the title, and much of our business, 80%, as you say, of the profits coming from Asia. But would you argue ever to move to a regime controlled by China rather than London?
Well, that is a big issue, isn't it? I suppose there are two issues concerning relocation to Hong Kong. Well, three, really. There is a very stable the Hong Kong Monetary Authority is stable, and a very good regulator, so that's one plus. The other is really the size of the Hong Kong economy. I mean, HSBC, even after it's trimmed its balance sheet, is several times the GDP of Hong Kong. So whether Hong Kong could credibly say they were going to act as a sort of lender of last resort to the bank is a little bit troublesome. But the third and most important issue, I suppose, is the issue of political risk. You're right. I mean, Hong Kong is ultimately controlled by China, and that would be an issue. And on the other hand, China has made strong efforts to present itself as business and finance friendly, particularly through Hong Kong, over the last few years.
And just very briefly, should it decide to move, how damaging would that be to the rest of the city and what's left?
Well, I think it would be a blow to the confidence in the city. As I say, you remember the financial services in this country contribute something like about 8% of GDP, something like about 20% of London GDP alone, London income alone. So, we have to really think about, is it time to reform the culture of the banks, or should we just carry on punishing them?
Professor Mark Taylor, thank you very much.